Focus on your sight picture.
The general asked,
Take a breath
any
and
snipers?
press the trigger.
After 13 misses,
Nice shot.
one quiet woman
Stabilize
hit a
and prepare for
target
the
at
next round.
4,000 meters. The desert burned white under a ruthless sun, heat rippling across the long stretch of the firing range. Rows of rifles lay neatly on the benches, their barrels shimmering as if breathing. A formation of soldiers stood rigid beside them, boots sinking slightly into the sand, shoulders tight with the weight of failure. Every shooter had taken a turn. Every shot had veered off target. At 4,000 meters, the distant squares on the horizon looked more like mirages than real steel plates. And today, they might as well have been. A sudden roar tore through the heat. Any shooters left? The general's voice cracked across the lineup like a whip, carrying the kind of authority that turned spines to stone. He stepped forward, boots grinding against grit, jaw locked in a scowl sharp enough to cut through armor. His eyes swept the row of silent soldiers' disappointment, frustration, disbelief, all simmering beneath his glare. No one answered. A few looked down at the sand. Others clenched their teeth, ashamed of how badly the exercise had gone. At the far end of the formation stood a woman quiet, perfectly still, hands resting at her sides. Sunlight brushed against the edge of her cheek, revealing a calm expression that held no trace of embarrassment or fear. She didn't fidget, didn't shift her stance, didn't even blink more than necessary. Her presence barely registered against the rest of the formation, like a shadow someone had forgotten to notice. A corporal 2 places down let out a scoff. You? Don't even think about it. Another soldier snickered under his breath. Yeah, right. If the sharpshooters can't hit it, she's sure as hell not gonna. The general didn't look her way yet. Why would he? Nothing about her screamed sniper. No specialized patch, no bragging rights, no reputation that anyone here seemed to know. To most of them, she was just another low-ranking soldier trying not to melt under the desert Sunday. But she didn't shrink from the remarks. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even flinch. She simply breathed, slow, measured, controlled. The kind of breathing that didn't belong to someone terrified of failing. The kind of breathing that belonged to someone who knew the shot long before the barrel touched her shoulder. A gust of wind pushed across the formation, sending dust curling around their boots. A lieutenant wiped sweat from his brow and muttered, "This is pointless. No one hits at that distance without a miracle." The woman lifted her chin a fraction, just enough to be seen, never enough to look defiant. "Sir," she said quietly, the word almost carried away by the wind. It was the softest voice on the range, yet somehow the only one the general reacted to. He turned sharply, irritation knotting across his forehead. "What?" The question landed like a blow. She stepped forward once, the movement precise and deliberate, requesting permission to try, sir. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Several soldiers exchanged looks, mocking, confused, almost offended. One shook his head. Another whispered, "She's going to embarrass herself." A few simply stared at her, as though she had lost her mind. The general tilted his head, studying her as if she were a puzzle that didn't quite fit the picture. "You think you can do what 13 trained marksmen just failed to do?" She did not answer with bravado. She did not try to impress him. Her voice remained steady. "One shot, sir. That's all I ask." Something subtle shifted in the air. Barely noticeable, but present. A tremor of attention. A question unspoken. The kind of moment where even the wind seemed to hesitate, waiting. The general exhaled sharply, more annoyed than convinced. "Fine," he snapped. "Take the bench if you want to waste everyone's time." A few soldiers chuckled. Others rolled their eyes. A sergeant muttered, "This is going to be good," as if watching the setup to an inevitable failure. But she didn't look at them. She didn't acknowledge a single one of their doubts. She simply stepped toward the row of rifles, with a posture too controlled, too measured, too familiar with precision to belong to just another soldier. Her hand brushed the stock of the weapon, fingers moving with an ease that didn't match her supposed rank. For a second, just a second, the sleeve of her uniform shifted, revealing the faint edge of a marking underneath. A symbol too worn to identify, too old to belong on a regular soldier's arm, too secret for anyone here to understand. No one noticed, not yet. But the way she inhaled, the way her eyes narrowed toward the shimmering horizon, carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had done this before. Someone who didn't need permission to be extraordinary. Someone whose silence held more authority than every voice mocking her. And in that fragile, breath-held moment, The desert seemed to lean closer, waiting for the world to realize what it was standing next to. The woman lowered herself beside the bench with a slow, deliberate motion that drew more curiosity than respect, allowing the weight of every dismissive glance behind her to settle into the sand without touching her composure. Several soldiers shifted uneasily as she inspected the rifle with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the frustration and embarrassment still clinging to the rest of the lineup like heat. The general crossed his arms, watching her with the wary irritation of a man certain he was about to witness another failure performed in front of his already disappointed command. A sergeant leaned toward the soldier next to him, whispering just loudly enough for her to hear that the rifle she grabbed was slightly misaligned after being handled poorly by the previous shooter, a subtle sabotage intended to shame her while masking itself as routine equipment fatigue. The remark earned a muted chuckle, and someone muttered that she would not even notice the imbalance until the shot sailed off into the dunes, proving the general right about wasting time. She still offered no reaction, her expression steady as she traced the line of the barrel with a practiced touch that suggested she had registered the flaw long before anyone attempted to weaponize it against her. Instead of resetting the weapon entirely, she disengaged the bolt with a quiet click and made a minute adjustment to the front rail, fingers moving with a level of technical familiarity that caused the lieutenant standing behind her to blink, uncertain of what exactly he had just seen. Her breathing remained measured, a controlled rise and fall that contrasted with the fidgeting shoulders of the soldiers who now found themselves inexplicably uneasy. The sand shifted beneath her elbows as she settled into a firing position, aligning herself with the distant target that shimmered like a ghost at the edge of the range. Behind her, the general exhaled sharply, irritated that she had not rushed or hesitated or asked for instruction, but instead moved with the same quiet ownership that belonged to someone who understood weapons more intimately than the people mocking her. His voice cut through the hot air with the sharp authority of a command meant to reassert dominance, reminding the formation that the distance was unforgiving and that even trained marksmen struggled to compensate for the shifting wind. Several soldiers nodded vigorously, eager to reinforce his point and dismiss the possibility of her success before she even pulled the trigger. Yet her focus did not drift for even a second, and her eyes remained locked onto the distant square as if she were tracking something far more tangible than a mirage. A few soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her, an almost imperceptible tightening of intent that rippled outward like a faint shockwave. The sergeant who had mocked her earlier frowned, suddenly aware that her breathing had become completely synchronized with the rhythm of the wind, as though she were listening to the range itself instead of the soldiers behind her. The moment stretched, slow and heavy, as she adjusted her grip with a level of precision that unsettled the corporal who had laughed first, making him mutter that she was overthinking the fundamentals, even though something in his voice betrayed a growing uncertainty. The general tapped his boot impatiently, demanding to know whether she planned to shoot before the sun set, his tone thick with the assumption that pressure would fracture her calm. She did not answer, because answering was never part of her nature. Instead, she shifted her weight a fraction of an inch, aligning her shoulder with the rifle in a way that made one of the older lieutenants narrow his eyes in recognition of a technique he had not seen in years. The heat pressed down hard on the assembled soldiers, carrying the chorus of their doubt into the back of her silence, but none of it broke through the focused shell she had built around herself. She studied the horizon with an intensity that made the snickering gradually fade, replacing easy mockery with the unease of not understanding what they were witnessing. The corporal nudged the soldier beside him, whispering again that she would miss by an embarrassing margin, but his voice lacked the confidence it held earlier, and his eyes kept drifting toward her with an involuntary caution. One of the younger privates wiped his palms on his uniform, not because he feared her success, but because he felt the strange awareness that the range itself had quieted around her. The wind shifted, though not enough to favor the shot. Instead, it brushed past her sleeve and revealed a faint line of worn fabric that hinted at something underneath, a hidden marking dulled by time and sweat. The glimpse lasted only a heartbeat, but the private inhaled sharply, uncertain of whether he had imagined the symbol or simply failed to understand its significance. She eased her cheek against the stock with the gentle familiarity of someone who had repeated the motion thousands of times in places far harsher than this controlled desert environment. Her finger rested along the trigger guard, not yet committed, but ready in the patient way of a hunter who knew the world, moved on a pace slower than human nerves. The lineup behind her fell into an uneasy stillness, each soldier suddenly hyper-aware of the quiet authority radiating from a woman they had dismissed only minutes before. The general opened his mouth to bark another warning, but the sound never came, halted by the inexplicable tension settling across the range like a sheet of glass. She exhaled slowly, letting the last of the noise behind her fall away, and for the first time since she stepped forward, not a single man dared to laugh. The air thickened with the collective realization that something was happening here, something small enough to miss and large enough to alter the direction of the entire exercise. And as she steadied the rifle in the cradle of her arms, the formation behind her finally understood they were no longer watching a reckless volunteer. They were witnessing the beginning of a quiet reveal none of them were prepared for. The range had fallen into such a heavy silence that every shallow breath seemed amplified against the vast desert, creating an atmosphere where even the general found himself hesitating before issuing another impatient order. As the woman steadied her grip and leaned subtly into the rifle, a senior warrant officer, who had been cataloging the earlier failed attempts from the shade of a nearby observation tent, stepped forward with a furrowed brow that suggested a sudden disruption in his routine. He had spent the entire morning watching well-trained marksmen misjudge the shifting winds, yet something about the woman's posture drew him closer, with the uneasy curiosity of someone recognizing a pattern he had not expected to see again. He paused a few paces behind her, studying the angle of her elbows and the measured distribution of her weight, noticing details that did not belong to an ordinary soldier attempting an impossible shot. His eyes drifted to the slight wrinkle in her sleeve where the wind had tugged earlier, and a faint memory stirred an impression of a forgotten emblem once worn by a unit that was whispered about rather than publicly acknowledged. The officer narrowed his gaze, unsure whether the worn fabric truly concealed what he suspected, but unable to dismiss the prickling certainty rising along his spine. The general finally noticed the officer's sudden interest and called out with sharp irritation, demanding to know why the man had abandoned his station during an already chaotic training session. The officer did not answer immediately, because his attention remained locked on the woman, tracing the deliberate precision of her adjustments with an expression that blended confusion, recognition, and a slowly surfacing disbelief. Several soldiers exchanged glances as the tension shifted from mocking amusement to an unsettled awareness that another authority figure was studying her with the same intensity she directed toward the distant target. One of the corporals nudged his friend, whispering that the warrant officer only stepped in when he suspected a training violation, though his uneasy tone suggested he no longer believed this was merely about enforcing protocol. The private who had noticed the mark earlier swallowed hard, trying to convince himself that the brief glimpse of worn fabric meant nothing, yet the officer's growing focus made him wonder whether he had just stumbled upon something prohibited. The general approached another step, his irritation masking a deeper, unspoken concern that something significant was happening outside his direct control. The woman remained completely unaware of the ripple she had caused across the range, or perhaps she simply chose not to acknowledge it, continuing to adjust the rifle with the calm patience of someone maintaining a ritual rather than performing for an audience. Her movements were small but decisive, each adjustment aligning the weapon with a kind of instinctive certainty that made the soldiers behind her shift uncomfortably, as they realized the pattern of her technique felt strangely reminiscent of stories they half remembered from late-night barracks folklore. The warrant officer stepped closer, ignoring the heat radiating from the sand, attempting to catch another glimpse of the hidden marking that might confirm his rapidly forming suspicion. A lieutenant colonel observing from the far end of the firing line noticed the commotion and called out in a demanding tone, questioning why the formation appeared distracted during a live-fire exercise. The general prepared to reprimand the troops for their lack of discipline, but the warrant officer raised a hand in a subtle gesture that halted him, surprising everyone within earshot. The unexpected interruption carried a weight that none of the enlisted soldiers could immediately interpret, and even the general's scowl faltered under the sudden shift in authority. The officer cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with an uncertainty that betrayed the significance of what he believed he had seen, and asked the woman to momentarily pause her preparation. She did not respond with irritation or confusion. Instead, she lifted her head just enough to acknowledge the request without losing her disciplined focus. Her eyes met his briefly, and the officer inhaled sharply as recognition solidified, revealing itself in the widening of his stance and the tightening of his grip on the clipboard he had carried throughout the exercise. Several soldiers leaned subtly forward, sensing the moment tipping towards something none of them had anticipated, although none could articulate the reason for their sudden apprehension. The general demanded an explanation, but the officer struggled to find words that would not sound absurd if spoken aloud, glancing again at the faint outline beneath the woman's uniform sleeve, before finally whispering that her posture, adjustments, and breathing patterns mirrored techniques associated with a long-disbanded reconnaissance unit. The statement rippled through the formation like a shockwave, silencing even the most skeptical soldiers as each man reacted to the possibility of standing beside someone far more dangerous and experienced than her rank suggested. The woman's expression did not change, though a soft exhale escaped her lips as if she had expected this moment to arrive eventually and had prepared herself for the subtle unraveling of her anonymity. The general stared at her with renewed scrutiny, his irritation fading into a calculating suspicion that made several soldiers shift their weight uneasily, uncertain whether they should feel intimidated, impressed, or both. The warrant officer stepped back slightly, not in retreat but in acknowledgement, as though he had just confirmed a truth too heavy to approach directly. Behind the formation, two more senior NCOs drifted closer, pretending to check equipment while clearly trying to catch their own glimpse of the concealed marking, exchanging quiet murmurs that betrayed a growing sense of disbelief. The private, who had first noticed the fabric shift, felt his stomach tighten with the realization that he might have witnessed the earliest clue to something far beyond a simple shooting demonstration, though he lacked the context to understand why the older men reacted with such seriousness. The woman lowered her gaze once more to the scope, her posture neither defensive nor prideful, but instead quietly accepting of the attention gathering behind her, as though she had lived through similar moments in darker, more isolated corners of the world. The weight of recognition hung over the range like a gathering storm, pulling the general, the officers, and the enlisted men into its pressure until even the wind seemed reluctant to break the rising tension. She adjusted the rifle one last time with a precision that looked far less like training and far more like memory, prompting several soldiers to instinctively hold their breath despite not understanding why. And as the realization settled across the lineup that the woman before them was no ordinary soldier, the atmosphere thickened with the unmistakable sensation that a long-dormant truth was preparing to surface, one that none of them were ready to confront, yet none could look away from. The range felt increasingly smaller as the tension tightened around the silent woman, creating an almost claustrophobic stillness beneath the wide, unforgiving desert sky that seemed to hang lower with every passing moment. The warrant officer's half-spoken recognition had already unsettled the formation, but the subtle shift in the soldier's breathing revealed a deeper, more instinctive awareness that something far beyond their rank structure was unfolding in real time. The general watched her with a rigidity he rarely displayed, partly out of irritation and partly out of a slowly rising suspicion he could not yet articulate, even as the officers around him exchanged uncertain glances, like men sensing an oncoming storm. The woman, however, moved with the steady patience of someone unbothered by the weight of attention gathering behind her, adjusting the rifle's cheek rest with a level of precision that caused several seasoned marksmen to tense unconsciously. She shifted her footing slightly and allowed the buttstock to settle deeper into her shoulder, demonstrating a subtle technique used primarily by high-tier reconnaissance units to eliminate microtremors during extreme distance engagements. A lieutenant who had previously mocked her swallowed hard, recognizing the posture despite never having seen anyone outside classified demonstrations employ it with such effortless familiarity. The general finally broke the silence with a clipped command, insisting that she had 30 seconds to demonstrate whatever she believed she was capable of, though his voice carried the unmistakable tremor of someone bracing for an outcome he no longer felt confident predicting. Instead of reacting to the ultimatum, she inhaled slowly and allowed the wind to brush against her cheek, counting the minor variations in direction with an intuitive ease that made the warrant officer's expression tighten further. Several soldiers exchanged bewildered looks as she extended her offhand toward the stock, applying a barely noticeable counterpressure that indicated she was compensating for the earlier sabotage without ever acknowledging it aloud. The shift in her demeanor was not dramatic, yet it changed the mood of the entire formation, transforming whispers of doubt into an uneasy quiet that hovered like static across the line. A corporal who had laughed at her earlier now watched with a sinking unease, realizing that none of her movements were improvised or hesitant, but rather formed from a sequence of practiced habits belonging to someone who had done this under conditions far harsher than a controlled training range. The private, who had glimpsed the faded symbol beneath her sleeve, felt a nervous weight settle into his stomach, sensing that he was witnessing the first crack in whatever carefully constructed anonymity she had carried into this assignment. She angled her head toward the scope and allowed her breathing to fall into a rhythm so controlled that the lieutenant colonel, observing from afar, instinctively straightened, recognizing the unmistakable signs of a shooter entering a deep focus state. The general barked another sharp reminder about her shrinking window of time, but even he seemed to understand that the warning no longer held the same authority it had moments earlier, as if the balance of control had begun to tilt toward the quiet woman lying in the dirt. Her finger remained disciplined along the trigger guard, waiting with the patience of someone who viewed precision not as a skill but as a personal obligation. The formation's posture subtly changed as more soldiers leaned forward, their earlier cynicism dissolving into a reluctant respect, driven not by sympathy but by the undeniable gravity of her movements. The warrant officer stepped closer, with the slow caution of a man approaching a long-buried truth, his eyes fixed on the faint outline beneath her sleeve that he now recognized with near certainty as the remnants of a symbol belonging to a unit officially dissolved years ago. His voice lowered to a whisper as he tried to confirm his suspicion with the lieutenant beside him, but the man could only shake his head in disbelief, unwilling to accept that a soldier of her apparent rank could have once served where he suspected she had. The woman exhaled again, longer this time, allowing the breath to settle her frame with a steadiness that made even the general hesitate before issuing another order. She gently nudged the rear bag supporting the rifle, aligning the reticle with a level of micro-precision that forced the corporal to shut his mouth mid-whisper, realizing that not a single motion she made deviated from the most advanced long-range doctrines he had ever witnessed. The soldiers behind her held their positions, though their bodies betrayed a mixture of awe and apprehension, as if they feared the truth of her identity might unravel something far larger than the training session itself. Her final adjustment came so naturally that several of the observers missed it entirely, noticing only the brief tension in her shoulder that signaled she had entered the moment of absolute stillness required for a kilometer-plus shot. A hush fell over the formation, as the desert wind paused just long enough to create the illusion that the entire landscape was waiting for her to act, and even the general's impatience faltered under the weight of the mounting anticipation. The woman rested her finger lightly on the trigger, and although she had not yet fired, the officers watching her felt the unmistakable shift from technical preparation to something far more consequential. The range grew impossibly quiet, as if the world itself had stepped back to grant her the space needed to demonstrate the truth she had spent so long concealing, and the soldiers behind her finally understood that they were witnessing the opening edge of a reveal that would not be easily forgotten. The warrant officer straightened his spine with the reverence of someone recognizing a legend in the making. Though he dared not speak aloud, the name he suspected belonged to the woman now poised to shatter every expectation set before her. And as she settled her gaze into the scope with the unyielding calm of a professional who had faced far more dangerous horizons, the entire formation felt the atmosphere shift decisively, signaling that the first undeniable demonstration of her true capability was seconds away from rewriting everything they thought they understood about her. The woman allowed one final breath to escape her lips, with the controlled stillness of a veteran who had long ago learned to fuse instinct with discipline, creating a serene pocket of focus that felt almost unnatural amid the unbearable desert heat. The soldiers behind her watched with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant fascination as she tightened her grip by only a millimeter, settling into a shooting posture so refined that even the most experienced marksmen in the formation felt a pang of inadequacy stirring beneath their uniforms. The general lifted his chin to remind her that time was nearly gone, yet the words never left his mouth, because the moment swallowed them before he could muster the authority to speak. She pressed the trigger with a movement so soft it barely registered as motion, releasing the shot into the oppressive silence with a muted crack that seemed strangely subdued compared to the thunderous failures that had come before her. The rifle recoiled gently against her shoulder, and the faint echo rolled across the dunes like a distant drumbeat, carrying with it the weight of a decision that none of the soldiers had expected from someone they had dismissed only minutes earlier. Several heads instinctively tilted upward, tracking the invisible path of the bullet as if hoping to witness some sign of its trajectory in the shimmering air above the range. For a brief moment, nothing moved except the dust curling around their boots, and a quiet murmur of doubt began to rise among the soldiers who had convinced themselves that no one could possibly land a shot across such a merciless distance. The general exhaled sharply, already preparing to reprimand her for wasting the unit's time, when a faint metallic ping echoed across the barren expanse with the delicate clarity of glass cracking under pressure. The distant target shuddered ever so slightly, its subtle tremor barely visible yet unmistakable to anyone with even minimal experience on a range. Shock rippled through the formation with the force of an unseen blast, stripping away every ounce of arrogance and doubt that had previously filled the air. A sergeant who had mocked her earlier blinked repeatedly, unsure whether his mind was tricking him or whether the impossible had actually occurred, while the private beside him whispered a shaky confirmation that the plate had indeed moved. The warrant officer inhaled a stunned breath, feeling the sound pierce his chest like an electric jolt, because he knew the distance was far too unforgiving for luck or accident to explain what they had just witnessed. The general stepped forward with a stiffness that suggested his body was acting against his will, drawn toward the truth like a man watching the foundations of his authority shift beneath the weight of a revelation he did not want to accept. He lowered his binoculars with an unsteady hand, the disbelief in his eyes betraying the certainty he had tried to impose on the formation only minutes earlier, and for the first time in years, his voice wavered as he demanded confirmation from the nearest officer. The lieutenant colonel raised his own binoculars with trembling fingers, wiping sweat from the lenses before staring across the range with the stunned expression of someone seeing a ghost appear in broad daylight. "Yes, sir." The plate took the hit, he managed, the words dry and brittle like sand blown too long in the wind, and several soldiers gasped quietly as the reality finally registered. The corporal who had rolled his eyes earlier felt heat flush through his face, realizing how thoroughly he had misjudged her, while the private, who had glimpsed the marking beneath her sleeve, found his pulse accelerating with the unsettling awareness that his suspicion might not have been wrong after all. Even the harsh desert breeze seemed to shift in acknowledgement, brushing against their uniforms with a subtle force that felt almost ceremonial in its timing. The woman had not moved since the shot, maintaining her posture with the calm precision of someone waiting for the range to catch up with what she already knew, and the stillness of her frame only deepened the confusion of the men watching her. She exhaled softly, not in triumph or relief, but with the quiet certainty of a professional performing a routine task that demanded no applause. The warrant officer took another step closer, the recognition in his eyes transforming from suspicion to dawning conviction, and the lieutenant beside him murmured that her technique matched archival footage he had once seen during a classified training rotation years prior. The general cleared his throat in an attempt to reassert control, yet even his voice carried an involuntary tremor as he ordered her to lift her head and stand at attention. She complied with a composed grace that further unsettled the officers, revealing nothing but disciplined obedience despite the entire formation shifting its posture to accommodate her rising presence. Several soldiers took an instinctive half-step backward as she stood, as if making room for a truth they could feel approaching like a heavy tide, even though none of them understood precisely what they were witnessing. The private who had first noticed the faint symbol beneath her sleeve now stared openly, waiting for another glimpse that might confirm the identity forming in his imagination, though he lacked the vocabulary to describe the weight carried by legends whispered in barracks during late-night guard rotations. Two senior NCOs approached the general with unease etched across their faces, quietly suggesting that her shooting posture and breathing pattern were identical to those used by a long-disbanded unit whose records were so classified that even they had only heard fragments of the stories. The general's expression tightened at the implication, and his jaw clenched with the heavy realization that he might have inadvertently challenged someone far beyond his understanding. The woman remained silent as the formation slowly rearranged itself around the truth emerging in their midst, standing with the poised patience of someone accustomed to being underestimated, until decisive moments demanded her to reveal fragments of the expertise she carried, like a hidden burden. Her calmness did not waver despite the growing storm of recognition swirling behind her, and the air around the range felt increasingly charged as though the desert itself had paused in anticipation of the identity lingering just beneath the surface. Every soldier present understood instinctively that the single shot she had delivered was not merely a demonstration of technical skill, but the first undeniable signal that their earlier assumptions were about to collapse under the weight of a truth they were not prepared to encounter. And as the general stared at her with the reluctant respect of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted irrevocably, the entire formation held its breath, sensing that this shot, this impossible, crystalline hit, had been only the beginning of a revelation they could no longer avoid. The general approached her with a rigid posture that betrayed a mixture of pride, disbelief, and a rising unease he struggled to conceal, his boots grinding into the sand with the heavy cadence of a man realizing the balance of authority had shifted beneath him. He stopped barely an arm's length away, staring at the woman with an intensity sharpened by the echo of the impossible shot, still hanging in the desert air. And for a long moment he said nothing, as though searching for an explanation that would allow him to reclaim control. The soldiers behind him straightened instinctively, sensing the gravity of the moment as the warrant officer stood nearby with the poised tension of someone bracing for a truth long buried to finally surface. The general demanded that she identify her marksmanship training, yet his voice carried none of the dismissive bite it held earlier, instead revealing a strained curiosity shaped by a deeper fear that he already knew the answer. She responded with measured silence, neither defiant nor apologetic, allowing the weight of the situation to rest entirely on those who had misjudged her, and the quietness of her demeanor only amplified the growing uncertainty rippling through the formation. The warrant officer stepped into the general's peripheral vision with hesitant urgency, respectfully requesting permission to examine the faint symbol he believed he saw beneath her sleeve. The general shot him a sharp glare, demanding clarification, but the officer spoke with a steady conviction that made several soldiers straighten, as he explained that her posture, technique, and breathing matched the operational doctrine of a decommissioned reconnaissance unit once known for extreme-range interdiction missions. The statement deepened the silence across the range, turning every shifting grain of sand into a reminder of the gravity descending upon them, and the lieutenant colonel standing nearby swallowed hard, as though attempting to reconcile the idea with training records he had never been allowed to access. The general's jaw tensed visibly as he scrutinized the woman again, searching for any sign that would prove the suggestion absurd, yet finding none that could outweigh the evidence before his eyes. The warrant officer stepped closer with careful deliberation and requested that she extend her arm so he could verify his suspicion, and although the general hesitated, he eventually granted permission, with a clipped nod that betrayed how thoroughly the impossible shot had dismantled his confidence. She lifted her arm with calm precision, allowing the officer to gently pull back the worn fabric of her sleeve, revealing the faded threads of an insignia so distinct and so rarely encountered that several of the older NCOs inhaled sharply. The emblem, though weathered by time and missions never recorded, retained enough of its original shape to spark immediate recognition in those who had only ever heard rumors of what that symbol once represented. The general froze, his expression collapsing from defiance into a stunned rigidity that spread across his face like a fissure splitting through stone, as the warrant officer whispered that the emblem belonged to a long-classified sniper detachment rumored to have operated beyond conventional oversight. Several soldiers exchanged wide-eyed glances, struggling to reconcile the stories whispered in barracks with the quiet woman standing before them, whose presence had seemed unremarkable until she shattered their expectations with a single, pristine shot. The lieutenant colonel approached with visible caution, leaning in to examine the marking himself, and his hand trembled as he confirmed the officer's assessment with a hushed certainty. The general took half a step backward, not in fear, but in the dawning realization that he had unintentionally challenged someone who possessed capabilities his own doctrine had never fully taught, and his voice faltered as he attempted to address her again. The woman lowered her sleeve calmly, showing neither pride nor discomfort, carrying the weight of recognition with the same steady composure she had shown before the shot was ever fired. The soldiers behind her shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware that their earlier mockery had been directed at someone they would never have questioned if they had known the truth, and several of them looked away with flushed embarrassment. The warrant officer quietly explained that only a small number of individuals had ever been trained under the unit marked by that insignia, and most were believed to have vanished during operations that would never appear on official records. The mention of this history sent a subtle murmur through the formation, as though each soldier sensed they were standing closer to a legend than a mere colleague, and the realization created a palpable tension that dissolved whatever skepticism remained. The general rubbed the bridge of his nose with a weary motion, fighting the weight of his own misjudgment while trying to maintain some semblance of authority in the presence of someone who had evidently surpassed his expectations in every measurable way. The woman kept her gaze level and unbroken, offering no clarification concerning her past, silently reinforcing the impression that whatever she carried had never been meant for open discussion. The lieutenant colonel cleared his throat with deliberate respect, reminding everyone present that they might be dealing with an operative whose missions had required enforced anonymity, and his voice carried a tone of acknowledgement that made several younger soldiers square their shoulders in involuntary deference. The desert wind shifted again, lifting faint dust across the range as if echoing the movement of a curtain pulled back to reveal a truth long concealed. The general finally managed to speak, though his tone had softened considerably, shaped now by the reluctant respect of a man confronting a revelation that demanded a complete reevaluation of everything he believed about the woman before him. He requested confirmation of her unit affiliation, but she responded only with a quiet steadiness that made clear she would not divulge details not meant to be spoken aloud, and the subtle refusal carried an authority deeper than any rank stitched onto a uniform. The soldiers behind her felt a shiver crawl across their skin as they realized the gravity of her silence, interpreting it not as defiance but as adherence to protocols that none of them had ever been trained to understand. An older sergeant whispered to the corporal beside him that individuals from that unit were known to maintain confidentiality even under direct command scrutiny, and the corporal nodded weakly, feeling the weight of having misjudged someone whose operational history likely eclipsed his entire career. The warrant officer stepped back respectfully, acknowledging with a subtle nod that he had confirmed enough to adjust his stance toward her permanently, and the lieutenant colonel mirrored the gesture, with a solemnity reserved for individuals whose reputations were forged beyond ordinary systems. The general exhaled slowly, understanding that the range would no longer see this woman as a subordinate but as a presence carved from a world they were never meant to witness, and he allowed a long pause to settle before addressing the formation again. The soldiers remained silent, their eyes fixed on the woman with a mixture of awe, fear, and reverence, as though they expected the desert itself to shift in recognition of the truth hovering in the air. And as the weight of her identity pressed deeper into the stillness, every man present felt the unmistakable sense that the revelation they had just glimpsed was only the beginning of something far larger than any of them had imagined. The general stood unnervingly still for several long seconds, struggling to swallow the enormity of what he had just witnessed, while the desert wind pulled faint lines through the sand as if etching the moment permanently into the landscape. His expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, and then finally settled into a reluctant solemnity, revealing a subtle recognition that the hierarchy of the range had been rearranged by forces far beyond his command. The soldiers watched him with silent anticipation, sensing the tremor beneath his rigid posture, because any word he spoke next would determine how they were meant to understand the woman standing quietly before them. The warrant officer cleared his throat gently, reminding the general that the emblem he had seen was not merely a relic of an old reconnaissance detachment, but a marker associated with individuals cleared for missions existing only in the margins of classified records. The general closed his eyes briefly, as though searching for some plausible explanation that would prevent the truth from reshaping the entire chain of command. Yet every detail from her posture, to her breathing, to the impossible precision of her shot, mocked his attempts to minimize her significance. When he opened them again, the sharpness in his gaze had softened into a deeper, almost wary respect. He stepped forward with deliberate caution, asking her to state her designation, though his tone betrayed an understanding that she might refuse for reasons he had no authority to contest. She met his gaze with a calmness that felt strangely heavier than any declaration, offering only a measured silence that carried the weight of withheld histories no one here had earned the right to hear. The officers exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the peculiar etiquette surrounding operatives whose identities were bound by oaths deeper than rank structure, and the soldiers behind them felt the shift in atmosphere as discipline reconfigured itself around this unspoken truth. The general exhaled slowly, acknowledging in a hesitant voice that he now understood she was operating under clearances that rendered most questions inappropriate, a concession that sent a quiet ripple through the formation. Several younger soldiers straightened instinctively, unsure whether they should salute or stand at ease, while the older NCOs exchanged tense whispers that revealed a deepening awareness that someone extraordinary had been hidden in their midst. The corporal who had mocked her earlier stared at the ground, visibly crushed beneath the realization of his own ignorance, while the private beside him felt his pulse race as the weight of the reveal settled more heavily across the range. The warrant officer then addressed the formation with a low, steady voice, explaining that the woman's mark, though faded, matched the identification of a long-classified, deep-range infiltration team disbanded years earlier after undertaking operations whose records were sealed beyond conventional clearance. His words struck the soldiers like a hammer wrapped in velvet, soft enough not to break them yet, heavy enough to leave a bruise that would linger for the rest of their careers. The general listened closely, his jaw tightening around each detail, as though every confirmation pulled him further into the gravity of a truth he could no longer deny. The woman stood unmoving through the disclosure, holding the focus of every pair of eyes with the effortless gravity of someone who neither sought attention nor attempted to deflect it, embodying the discipline of an individual accustomed to existing in the shadows until circumstances forced her to reveal only what could not remain hidden. Her silence became its own form of confirmation, the kind that required no elaboration, because legends accrued meaning precisely from what was left unsaid. Several soldiers shifted their weight awkwardly, almost bowing without realizing it, as though instinct demanded a gesture of respect not mandated by regulation. The general finally straightened with a visible effort, addressing the formation with a voice that struggled to balance pride, shock, and the fragile recovery of authority, declaring that the demonstration they had witnessed should be regarded as an official validation of her capabilities. His statement carried a formal weight that resonated across the range, transforming the murmurs of disbelief into a unified stillness as every soldier accepted the new reality. The warrant officer nodded solemnly, adding that her presence among them should be treated with the highest respect, not because of rumors or insignia, but because she had just delivered proof in the purest language the military understood: performance under pressure. The lieutenant colonel stepped forward next, offering a precise salute shaped not by rank but by recognition of skill, causing several soldiers to mirror the gesture instinctively despite their confusion about whether it was appropriate. The woman returned the salute with modest restraint, her movements precise and respectful, yet free of the arrogance that might accompany someone whose ability had just shaken the confidence of an entire range. The general lowered his eyes for a brief moment, acknowledging internally that her silence held more power than most of his commands ever had. A tangible shift rippled across the formation as soldiers recalibrated their perception of her, replacing earlier mockery with a humbled reverence that made many avoid meeting her eyes directly, not out of fear but from the quiet understanding that they had witnessed something rare. The corporal stepped back slightly, aware that nothing he could say would undo the disrespect he had shown earlier, while the private beside him whispered that the stories about elite ghost units no longer felt like myths meant to entertain rookies. Even the older sergeants exchanged glances heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, realizing the hierarchy of the moment had been irrevocably altered. The woman remained calm as the weight of their recognition settled around her, absorbing the shift without changing her expression, as though she had navigated similar moments in far harsher environments, where acknowledgement held consequences rather than comfort. The general finally nodded to her with a gesture caught between apology and respect, silently conceding that whatever role she had played before arriving here extended far beyond any evaluation he could offer. His voice softened when he dismissed the formation temporarily, allowing everyone a moment to process what they had seen. As the soldiers dispersed into small, stunned clusters, their conversations carried a sense of awe, mixed with a dawning realization that the morning's routine exercise had become a chapter of institutional memory none of them would ever forget. The warrant officer remained nearby, watching her with the contemplative posture of a man who recognized that fate had allowed him to witness something extraordinary, perhaps even historic. The desert wind drifted across the range again, lifting her sleeve just enough to conceal the faded emblem once more, as though the world itself was gently restoring the secrecy that defined her. And as the atmosphere settled into a profound, reverent quiet, every soldier present understood that a new equilibrium had formed, one in which their respect was no longer commanded by rank or enforced by protocol, but earned through an undeniable truth revealed in a single, perfect shot. The woman remained near the firing bench long after the formation had dispersed, standing quietly beneath the wavering desert heat while the officers whispered in the background with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty. The warrant officer watched her from a respectful distance, sensing that her silence carried the weight of memories too heavy to articulate and too dangerous to disturb, yet he approached slowly, as if drawn by an obligation to acknowledge what the others only dared to speculate. The general lingered behind him with his arms tightly folded, struggling to reconcile her reserved posture with the haunting reputation of the unit whose emblem he had glimpsed beneath her sleeve. The officer cleared his throat before asking a gentle question about her previous assignments, though he already suspected that any answer she offered would be vague by necessity rather than choice. She turned her gaze toward the distant horizon, where the shimmering targets stood motionless, and her expression shifted subtly, revealing the shadow of a memory that had followed her across continents and years, with the persistence of a scar that never fully healed. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch until the general involuntarily adjusted his stance, as though bracing for an answer he feared might confirm rumors he had never dared to believe. When she finally spoke, her voice held a quiet resonance that hinted at experiences carved from darkness rather than glory, mentioning only that she had once served in regions where maps offered no guidance and official channels rarely reached. Her words carried an understated weight that suggested entire histories were being reduced to fragments for the sake of necessity, and the warrant officer felt a chill crawl up his spine as he recognized the practiced restraint of someone who had learned to bury details beneath layers of protocol. The general exchanged a subtle glance with the lieutenant colonel, understanding that her minimal explanation conveyed far more through omission than any elaborate story could have revealed. She paused again, recalling missions that had erased more than they documented, remembering landscapes so hostile that even the desert before them felt gentle in comparison, and the officers sensed that whatever she had endured extended far beyond tactical hardship. The faint tremor in her breathing suggested she was revisiting moments marked by the sudden crack of distant gunfire, the muffled echo of decisions made in abandoned buildings, and the quiet weight of operating where backup was a luxury rather than an expectation. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward her sleeve, brushing the outline of the faded emblem as though acknowledging a presence she had not spoken to in years. The warrant officer asked carefully why someone with her expertise had vanished from all operational rosters, but she deflected the question with a steady composure that hid the deeper truth beneath a surface of calm professionalism. Her silence, however, betrayed a lingering grief that suggested the disappearance had not been voluntary, and the general sensed the echo of loss in her posture, recognizing the posture of someone who had carried responsibility through nights torn by decisions that never left room for clean resolutions. The lieutenant colonel stepped closer with a softened expression, offering a respectful distance that affirmed their understanding without prying further into the classified shadow she carried. She finally admitted, in a low, unembellished tone, that her team had been reassigned to operations that demanded absolute disappearance, missions so sensitive that even mentioning their code name required clearances none of the present officers held. The implications settled over them with the weight of an approaching storm, and the warrant officer realized that her survival alone was evidence of a past marked by sacrifices hidden beneath layers of secrecy and necessity. The general inhaled sharply, recognizing that her quiet confidence had been forged not through accolades or rank but through experiences that could never be shared openly, even with those bound by oath. As she shifted her gaze away from the horizon, the officers noticed a flicker of something raw in her eyes, perhaps a memory of a teammate whose presence haunted her more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. The formation of soldiers, though now scattered across the range, seemed unable to shake the impression that they were standing in the aftermath of a story whose most important chapters would never be spoken aloud, and a subtle hush lingered between them, even when they attempted to resume their duties. The wind carried the faint scent of dust and distant heat, but beneath it lay the intangible sense that her past had not finished shaping her present. The general attempted to offer a comment acknowledging her resilience, yet the words faltered as he realized he lacked the vocabulary to address the depth of what she had endured, and the woman responded only with a quiet nod that carried more meaning than any formal acknowledgement. The warrant officer understood that her reappearance in a conventional training rotation was likely not an accident, and he wondered whether someone far above their rank had sent her as a precursor to a shift none of them were prepared to confront. His intuition prickled with the unsettling awareness that her presence might signal the reopening of an operation once considered permanently sealed. The woman then stepped aside, gently resting the rifle on the bench with the reverence of someone placing an old memory to rest, and the motion drew a collective breath from the officers as they recognized the significance of her gesture. She looked toward the base perimeter, where the heat shimmered in restless waves, and her expression hardened into a mixture of caution and anticipation, as though sensing a threat approaching from a direction she could feel before she could see. The general followed her gaze with a dawning unease, suddenly aware that the shot she had delivered was not merely a demonstration of skill, but a signal that she had re-entered a world where precision was demanded not for sport, but for survival. The warrant officer stepped back with deliberate care, acknowledging that whatever had driven her back into visible service had not yet revealed itself, and he felt certain the reason would eventually reach them, in a form none of them would welcome. The desert wind surged once more, carrying with it the faint metallic rattle of equipment in the distance, and the woman's posture shifted ever so slightly, revealing the instinctive readiness of someone who recognized the subtle tremor of danger long before others could interpret it. And as the officers exchanged uncertain glances beneath the heavy desert sun, they realized that her past had not returned to haunt her randomly. Rather, it had begun to stir with purpose, foreshadowing a larger conflict that threatened to pull her back into the shadows she had fought so hard to leave behind. The uneasy silence that had settled across the range began to fracture as a low mechanical rumble drifted in from the far perimeter, carrying with it a vibration that felt strangely out of place beneath the oppressive desert Sunday. The general looked up with a frown sharpening across his features, sensing that the sound did not belong to any scheduled training exercise, yet he hesitated before voicing concern, unwilling to reveal the apprehension growing behind his stern expression. Several soldiers paused mid-task, exchanging uncertain glances as the noise grew steadily louder, resonating with a frequency that triggered an instinctive tension none of them fully understood. The woman turned her head before anyone else reacted, her posture tightening with the unmistakable precision of someone recognizing a pattern the others lacked the experience to interpret, and the warrant officer felt a chill climb his spine as he watched the focus return to her eyes. The desert wind shifted direction suddenly, pushing dust across the firing line in an uneven wave, and the lieutenant colonel glanced toward the distant vehicle depot with a deepening suspicion that the sound represented a breach rather than an equipment transfer. The corporal who had previously mocked her swallowed hard, sensing the unease radiating from her stance and realizing that instinct, not rank, was guiding her perception. The rumble grew into a harsh mechanical growl that rolled over the sand like the warning of an approaching storm, prompting the general to finally demand a status report from the communications tent, though his voice revealed cracks that no one dared acknowledge aloud. The radio operator stuttered through static, attempting to clarify the message streaming in from the security grid, but the transmission broke repeatedly, dissolving into fragmented warnings about unauthorized motion along the restricted access road. The warrant officer stiffened noticeably, recognizing the code sequence embedded in the scrambled transmission and understanding its implications with a clarity that made his breath falter. As the noise shifted into a sharper metallic rattle, the woman stepped forward instinctively, scanning the horizon with the same disciplined efficiency she had displayed at the rifle bench, and the general barked at her to remain in formation. She ignored the command not out of arrogance but because her instincts were already calculating trajectories, assessing exposure points, and identifying the most probable angle of approach with the precision of someone who had survived countless ambushes in terrain, far less forgiving than this controlled training zone. The soldiers around her froze, sensing that her reaction held a level of urgency far beyond anything the chain of command had considered possible. A sudden alarm blared from the distant watchtower, cutting through the desert air like a blade and confirming that the perimeter's automated sensor grid had detected movement inconsistent with friendly identification signatures. The general swung toward the tower with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, demanding an explanation, but the watch officer shouted that one of the unmanned vehicles had broken from its assigned route and was accelerating toward the range without authorization. The lieutenant colonel cursed under his breath, recognizing the danger such a runaway machine posed to the scattered soldiers, especially if it carried live ordnance or malfunctioning navigation protocols. The woman reacted before anyone else could process the implications, moving with a decisive speed that startled even the warrant officer, who had begun to understand the depth of her past missions. She sprinted toward the nearest equipment rack, grabbing a pair of binoculars with a fluid motion that hinted at countless hours spent assessing threats through far harsher lenses, and she raised them to her eyes with calm precision as the approaching vehicle crested the outer dune. The general shouted at her again, but his voice broke beneath the rising alarm, and the soldiers watched in stunned silence as she tracked the rogue machine with the focus of a predator locking onto prey. Through the binoculars, she identified the telltale oscillation in the vehicle's front suspension, recognizing that its steering algorithm had malfunctioned in a way consistent with a corrupted command module, and she knew instantly that the machine would barrel straight through the firing line if not stopped. The warrant officer saw the tension in her shoulders and understood her assessment even before she lowered the binoculars, because the look in her eyes carried the same cold certainty he had witnessed in operatives preparing to act without hesitation. The lieutenant colonel turned toward the general with a pale expression, urging him to authorize a shutdown command, but the comms tent responded with panicked static, explaining that the override system had completely failed. The vehicle surged closer with increasing speed, kicking up sand in violent spirals as its engines screamed against the corrupted navigation code, and several soldiers instinctively backed away from the firing line, unable to reconcile the sudden threat with the training environment they had trusted moments ago. The general shouted for everyone to clear the area, but his command came too late, because the machine was now hurtling toward them at a velocity that would crush anyone unable to evade its path. The woman, however, stood perfectly still for a split second, calculating distance, angle, and structural weak points with the clarity of someone accustomed to confronting danger under far worse conditions. Without waiting for permission, she moved toward the bench where the rifle lay, her strides purposeful and unwavering, while the soldiers stared in disbelief as she shouldered the weapon with the instinctive fluidity of someone returning to a role carved into bone. The general began to protest, demanding she fall back, but his words dissolved under the roar of the approaching engine, and he realized with dawning clarity that she had already seen the only solution available. The warrant officer murmured a shaky acknowledgement that stopping the vehicle required a precision shot to the sensor housing, and only someone with her background could deliver such accuracy under extreme pressure. She positioned herself at the edge of the range, dropping into a firing stance that radiated confidence shaped by missions performed beyond recorded history, and the soldiers held their breath as she aligned the scope with a target no larger than a clenched fist at a rapidly closing distance. The moment stretched into an impossibly tense silence, broken only by the grinding metal of the rogue vehicle and the faint click of her stabilizing breath. Her finger curled toward the trigger with the same measured decisiveness she had displayed earlier. Yet this time, the urgency behind the shot carried consequences far heavier than a demonstration for skeptical onlookers. And as she prepared to fire, every soldier present understood instinctively that her past, which had hovered like a distant shadow throughout the morning, had now surged to the surface with undeniable force, reclaiming her with the same relentless certainty that drove her to act when others froze. The rogue vehicle barreled across the outer dune with a violent burst of sand spiraling around its wheels, and the shrill whine of its malfunctioning guidance system reverberated through the desert like a warning no one was prepared to confront. The woman steadied her feet against the shifting ground, anchoring her posture in a manner that blended instinct with memory, creating a stance born not from training manuals but from the raw, unfiltered experience of surviving missions where hesitation meant death. Several soldiers stumbled backward in panic, unable to reconcile the sight of a runaway machine with the controlled environment they had trusted moments ago, while the general attempted to shout instructions that dissolved beneath the overwhelming roar of the accelerating engine. The warrant officer recognized the impossible position they were in and stepped closer with a trembling urgency, whispering that disabling the vehicle through conventional methods was no longer feasible because the corrupted navigation module would override any remote shutdown attempt. The lieutenant colonel paled as the woman lowered her cheek to the stock of the rifle, understanding before anyone else that she was preparing to attempt a non-standard override maneuver, typically reserved for operatives trained to neutralize autonomous threats under catastrophic field conditions. The general yelled for everyone to fall back to a secondary barrier, but his command barely reached the soldiers closest to him because the woman's calm precision had already captured the attention of every pair of eyes on the range. She exhaled slowly, letting the chaos around her fall away until only the essential components of the threat remained in her mind: distance, velocity, structural vulnerability, and the narrow window in which the shot could still prevent disaster. The rogue vehicle's onboard sensor housing rattled violently as it bounced over uneven patches of sand, creating a constantly shifting target, no larger than an exposed fist. Yet she tracked it with an unbroken steadiness that defied the physical limitations of ordinary marksmanship. The corporal, who had previously mocked her, clutched his helmet with shaking hands, whispering a disjointed prayer as he realized she was attempting a shot that most expert snipers would refuse under stable conditions, let alone in the midst of a malfunctioning charge. The desert trembled as the machine closed the remaining distance with terrifying speed, forcing several soldiers to dive for cover while the officers shouted conflicting orders that did nothing to slow the impending catastrophe. The woman adjusted her aim by a fractional degree, compensating for the unpredictable pitch of the vehicle's frame as it hit another ridge, and the warrant officer felt his throat tighten when he recognized the subtle shift in her breathing that marked the transition from conscious calculation to instinctive execution. The general watched in frozen disbelief, suddenly aware that he was witnessing a level of precision his own command had neither trained for nor fully understood, and the realization drained the color from his face. Her finger tightened around the trigger with the soft finality of a decision made long before this moment, releasing the shot into the roaring chaos with a muted crack that seemed impossibly calm against the frenetic noise surrounding her. The bullet cut through the shimmering air with an almost imperceptible whistle, following a trajectory so unforgiving that the slightest deviation would have rendered the attempt catastrophically meaningless. For a fraction of a second, even the wind seemed to hesitate, holding its breath as the round raced toward the rapidly shifting panel beneath the vehicle's front array. The impact came with a sharp metallic pop, followed by a violent jolt that sent the vehicle lurching sideways as its corrupted guidance system collapsed under the sudden loss of sensor integrity. The machine spun in a harsh arc across the sand, skidding dangerously close to the barricade where several soldiers had taken cover, before finally grinding to a stop in a plume of dust that settled over the range like a shroud. The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy, pressing down on every chest with the weight of a collective realization that disaster had been a heartbeat away from claiming half the formation. The general staggered forward, his boots dragging through the sand as though his legs were struggling to carry the enormity of what he had just witnessed, and he stared at the disabled vehicle with wide, disbelieving eyes. The warrant officer exhaled shakily, instinctively pressing a hand to his chest as he attempted to regain composure, overwhelmed by the knowledge that no ordinary soldier could have executed a shot under those conditions with such flawless precision. The lieutenant colonel wiped sweat from his brow, even though the wind had cooled, understanding that the woman's actions had saved not only the men on the range, but the integrity of the base itself, which would have suffered catastrophic damage had the machine reached the ammunition depot. Several soldiers emerged cautiously from behind protective barriers, staring at the woman with expressions that blended awe, relief, and a dawning recognition that the stories whispered about elite Ghost Unit operatives had not been exaggerations but pale shadows of the real capability standing before them. The corporal who had laughed earlier sank to his knees with a mixture of guilt and gratitude, understanding that her silence had not been weakness, but a shield forged from burdens he could not begin to comprehend. The private who had glimpsed the faded emblem on her sleeve felt tears sting the back of his eyes, recognizing the shape of a legend that had once been spoken only in hushed fragments during long night shifts. The woman rose slowly from her firing stance, lowering the rifle with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the adrenaline still pulsing through the formation, and she scanned the horizon with the lingering vigilance of someone who had not yet accepted the crisis as resolved. The general approached her with visible hesitation, wrestling with the fractured pieces of his authority, as he attempted to find words that could acknowledge the gravity of what she had accomplished without exposing the vulnerability he felt. His voice, normally sharp and commanding, emerged as a muted rasp when he finally thanked her, though the inadequacy of the gesture hung awkwardly between them. She responded with a quiet nod, offering neither humility nor pride, because the action she had taken belonged to a version of her forged long before she stepped onto this range. The warrant officer stepped forward next, his posture rigid with respect, acknowledging that she had performed a maneuver so advanced that only a handful of operatives in military history had ever been recorded, executing it successfully. The lieutenant colonel murmured a similar acknowledgement, adding that the precision required to neutralize a malfunctioning autonomous threat under such conditions bordered on the unbelievable, yet she had treated the moment with the calm efficiency of a routine field correction. As dust settled over the disabled vehicle and the tension slowly unwound through the formation, every soldier present understood with absolute clarity that her earlier demonstration had been only a glimpse of the skill she possessed. The general inhaled deeply, recognizing that the moment had irrevocably shifted their understanding of her identity, and that whatever secrets she carried had begun to reveal themselves in ways no one could ignore. And as the woman stood amid the settling silence, the entire range finally grasped the truth. She was not simply returning to the shadows of her past. She was being summoned back by events far larger than any of them yet understood. The dust began to settle in slow, drifting spirals around the disabled vehicle, leaving behind a stark silence that pressed against the range like a held breath waiting for someone to claim ownership of the moment. The general stood motionless at first, locked between shock and responsibility, struggling to reconcile the rigid hierarchy he had always enforced with the undeniable reality that the quiet woman before him had just executed a maneuver that surpassed anything recorded in the unit's operational history. Several officers hovered uncertainly behind him, exchanging uneasy glances as they recognized the growing need to formally acknowledge what instinct had already confirmed. The range no longer revolved around rank, but around the individual whose single decision had saved them all. With a visible effort, the general straightened his posture, brushing sand from his uniform before stepping toward her with the solemn deliberation of a man preparing to perform a ceremony he had never expected to enact. The soldiers, scattered across the range only minutes earlier, drifted instinctively into a loose formation, pulled together not by command but by the gravity of witnessing an event that deserved collective recognition. The warrant officer moved to the front with the quiet authority of someone who understood what needed to happen, his expression carrying a reverence that softened the edges of the tension still hanging in the air. The woman stood calmly at the center of the gathering attention, holding the rifle at her side with the ease of someone accustomed to being observed after moments of crisis, yet the stillness in her gaze suggested she would have preferred anonymity over admiration. The general approached her with his chin lifted, though the firmness in his demeanor was tempered by a deep humility that revealed itself in the careful cadence of his footsteps. When he finally stopped before her, the silence thickened as every soldier watched him with an intensity that reflected the weight of the moment pressing upon them. He raised his hand slowly and delivered a crisp salute, his expression hardening into a mask of respect rather than command, signaling to the entire formation that the dynamic of the range had irrevocably shifted. The officers behind him followed suit, some with hesitation born of disbelief, others with the solemn understanding that they were standing in the presence of someone whose operational pedigree transcended traditional rank. The soldiers mirrored the gesture a beat later, their collective movements forming a wave of acknowledgement that radiated through the formation like a structured echo of their new reality. She returned the salute with the composed precision of someone trained to maintain decorum regardless of circumstances, yet the faint tension in her shoulders revealed a quiet discomfort at being placed at the center of a ceremony she had never sought. The general cleared his throat and addressed the formation in a voice that carried the heavy timbre of a man unaccustomed to expressing gratitude so openly, acknowledging that her actions had prevented catastrophic loss and demonstrated capabilities that demanded the highest level of military respect. His words flowed with careful restraint, tempered by the awareness that he was addressing someone whose background likely exceeded anything he could formally recognize. The warrant officer stepped forward next, speaking with the steady reverence of someone who understood the deeper implications of her reappearance, explaining that her precision, timing, and improvisation reflected operational conditioning reserved for individuals once considered national assets rather than conventional soldiers. Several younger troops exchanged bewildered glances, absorbing the magnitude of the revelation as though pieces of a larger puzzle were falling into place with startling clarity. The corporal who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably, clutching his helmet as guilt settled into his expression, while the private beside him whispered that they might be witnessing the reinstatement of someone who had once served in missions discussed only in classified rumors. The general stepped aside to allow the lieutenant colonel to speak, and the older officer addressed her with a tone shaped not by authority but by professional admiration, acknowledging that her response to the crisis had demonstrated the kind of instinctual accuracy typically associated with operatives trained to act autonomously in the absence of command. He bowed his head slightly, signaling a deferential respect that spread subtly through the formation as soldiers adjusted their posture, realizing the power dynamics had transitioned from command-driven to capability-centered. The desert wind shifted again, brushing softly against their uniforms as though validating the ceremony unfolding on the sand. She stood through the acknowledgments with a stoic composure that masked the shadows lingering in her eyes, recognizing that each word carried an implication she had hoped to avoid by stepping away from the world she once inhabited. The weight of her past pressed faintly against the surface of her calm demeanor, yet she neither denied nor embraced the recognition, instead allowing the moment to wash over her with the disciplined acceptance of someone who understood that survival often required surrendering to circumstances rather than resisting them. The warrant officer watched her carefully, noting the subtle changes in her posture that hinted at a reluctance to stand at the center of an emerging narrative. The general finally addressed the formation again, declaring that her actions would be logged as an exemplary demonstration of emergency intervention under extreme operational pressure, though every soldier understood that the official language could never capture the full magnitude of what they had just witnessed. He then stepped closer, lowering his voice as he acknowledged directly to her that he no longer considered her presence within his command to be temporary or ceremonial, but essential to the safety and readiness of the unit under his responsibility. The statement carried a depth of sincerity that startled several of the officers, revealing a shift in authority that none had expected to unfold so publicly. The woman inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement, accepting the general's words with the restrained dignity of someone who had spent years navigating environments where recognition was a rarity rather than a reward. Her silence resonated through the formation, creating an echo of stillness that pulled every soldier further into the gravity of her presence, and several enlisted troops unconsciously adjusted their stance as if realigning themselves around an unspoken center of command. The desert seemed to soften under the weight of the ceremony, its vast emptiness transforming into a stage upon which a new hierarchy had been quietly constructed. As the general dismissed the formation with a voice softened by lingering awe, the soldiers dispersed into small, hushed groups, carrying with them the unmistakable sense that they had witnessed a turning point in their unit's history. The officers lingered longer, exchanging subdued conversations about the implications of her capabilities and the likelihood that higher command would soon take an interest in her unexpected emergence. And as the woman stood alone once more near the firing bench, the range seemed to shift subtly around her, acknowledging her not as a visitor or an anomaly, but as the new center of gravity that every man present would instinctively orient toward in the days to come. The range gradually emptied as the sun dipped lower across the desert horizon, leaving long bands of amber light stretching across the sand like quiet reminders of everything that had unfolded beneath the searing midday heat. The woman remained near the firing bench long after the last cluster of soldiers drifted away, standing in a stillness that felt neither triumphant nor exhausted, but reflective in the way only those shaped by long, difficult histories could ever fully embody. The warrant officer watched her from a respectful distance, sensing that she needed space to let the weight of the day settle without interruption. Yet he lingered nearby in case acknowledgement, not conversation, might be welcome. The general approached her slowly, carrying a softened presence that contrasted sharply with his earlier authority, and he stopped beside her with the careful restraint of someone recognizing the fragility of the silence she held. He thanked her again with a sincerity that resonated more deeply now, expressing a quiet understanding that her actions had protected far more than just the lives on the range, though he admitted he lacked the full vocabulary to articulate the truth behind that sentiment. She nodded once, offering a subtle gesture of respect without inviting further discussion, because the deeper motivations for her intervention belonged to chapters of her life that lay far beyond his sphere of influence. As the wind shifted across the dune line, she lifted her gaze toward the distant ridges shimmering beneath the fading light, and the general sensed an unspoken philosophy woven into her silence, one built on loyalty that had long survived the collapse of formal titles and vanished units. The warrant officer stepped forward with hesitant caution, sharing that the soldiers would likely speak of her actions for years to come, yet she responded with a faint, almost bittersweet smile that revealed her discomfort with being placed into stories she had never sought to inhabit. She murmured that legacies often came uninvited, shaped by moments rather than intentions, and that true service rarely required an audience to hold its value. The lieutenant colonel joined them with the subdued respect of someone who had spent the afternoon reevaluating the boundaries of what he believed possible, and he offered a quiet salute that carried the weight of genuine gratitude rather than obligation. She returned it with the graceful precision expected of someone whose discipline had been forged through far harsher trials than anything the base could replicate, and the gesture seemed to close the final emotional distance between them. When the officers finally withdrew, giving her space to breathe, the desert settled into a peaceful hush, as though acknowledging the quiet transition from crisis to afterglow. A few younger soldiers remained near the perimeter fence, watching her with wide eyes that struggled to balance reverence with the lingering disbelief of having witnessed something extraordinary, yet none dared approach her directly. She offered them a faint nod from across the range, a soft reassurance that required no words, and the simple gesture eased the last tension in their shoulders before they returned to their duties with renewed purpose. The corporal who had mocked her earlier paused longer than the others, overwhelmed by a mixture of shame and admiration, and though she noticed the hesitation, she allowed him the dignity of walking away without demanding apology or acknowledgement. As the final traces of daylight stretched thin along the horizon, she picked up the rifle one last time, examining the worn edges of the stock with a tenderness that suggested the weapon reminded her of missions she would never speak about aloud. She set it back down with deliberate care, as though closing a chapter she had not expected to reopen when the day began, and her expression softened into a contemplative calm that hinted at both closure and quiet anticipation. The warrant officer approached again, sensing a shift in her posture, and asked with gentle curiosity whether the day's events meant she planned to return to active operations. She answered without turning her head, her voice carrying a subtle resolve forged through years of disciplined service, explaining that some paths had a way of finding those who once walked them, regardless of how far they tried to step away. The officer nodded slowly, recognizing that her future had begun reshaping itself the moment she fired the first impossible shot, and that the broader conflict hinted at by her instincts would soon reveal itself in ways none of them could yet predict. The general remained silent behind them, accepting the truth with a sober understanding that her presence would likely be requested by higher command before sunrise. When she finally stepped away from the bench, the range seemed to tilt subtly around her, as if acknowledging that her legacy had already begun imprinting itself on the desert floor with every measured step she took. The fading sunlight cast a long shadow behind her, merging with the ridgelines in a way that made her silhouette appear less like a soldier walking off duty and more like a sentinel, reclaiming a role she had carried long before any of them learned her name. And as she disappeared into the warm haze stretching toward the base, every soldier present understood that her story had not concluded here, it had merely awakened, preparing to move toward whatever unseen horizon had just quietly called her back into motion.